Welcome to Manifested Publishers.
Hello, students. Welcome once again to our today's lesson. We're going to have a lesson in history and government, that is Form 4. We're going to have a lesson in history and government. That is the lesson we are going to have today. And today we are going to introduce a new topic. We are going to introduce a new topic, which is the second topic, that is international relations. International relations. So I hope you are doing well as you continue to learn. And today we are going to introduce a new topic, international relations. Previously, we have learned a topic, or we have been studying a topic that we called world wars, and we studied the different wars, and we said world war is a war that engaged many countries and was fought in more than one continent. And we discussed in detail the world wars that have been experienced in the world. That is the First World War, the Second World War. We interrogated the different countries that were involved in this war. And now we are going to take a step further and look at international relations as our new topic. So from what we learned in our previous topic, that is the world wars, we discovered that the world war was not a very good. The world wars that were engaged, that people were engaged in the world, were not very good. They had devastating effect on the economies of people. They had serious effects on the lives of people, because we mentioned that a lot of lives were lost. Countries spend huge amounts of money during this war. So immediately after the Second World War, there was now a period of peace, and now the countries were motivated to find amicable ways of solving their issues. They had to find ways in which they could interact with each other, or nations could be able to have relations with other people. That is what we are going to be discussing and studying in our topic, international relations. We are going to ask ourselves, how did now, from the war moving forward, because initially countries were so much psyched up against one another, trying to compete against one another, until there was an outbreak of war. Now, because they have seen, they have tasted, the countries have tasted and have seen the effects of a world war. Now, what steps did they take? What were the steps that were taken to make sure that there was now a period of peace, or if there is any conflict, if there is any, right, the people or the countries could be able to interact, or be able to view each other, or solve their problems in a more amicable way. So that is what we are going to be discussing in this topic. So we are going to start with how, the first thing that we are going to look at, how do people, or methods, or ways of interaction. Remember, initially, nations were competing against one another. They were competitors. But now, we are now, after the First and the Second World War, there were now new ways in which nations could interact with one another. That is one thing that we are going to be looking at, or we are going to be studying in this topic, international relations. And then we are also going to look at the organizations the organizations which are international, the organizations that were created to make sure that there was a period of peace or people could interact with one another. And among these nations, we are going to look at the United Nations. That is the first organization that you are going to look at. Then you're also going to look at the Commonwealth. I'm sure you have been able to hear that word. We are going to now to interrogate and learn what does it, or what is this organization. And then we're also going to look at the other one, the non-aligned movement. Let me write it. It's non-aligned movement. We are going to be discussing more. So when we talk of this, we are going to be asking ourselves, how are they formed? We're going to look at their formation. We're going to learn about their formation, how they were formed, and then their structure or organs. How are they structured? How do they carry out their activities? That is another thing that we are going to be discussing in each of these. And then we're also going to look at their performance. We're going to look at their performance. We're going to look at their performance. How did they perform? Were they able to succeed? Did they fail in any way? Do they have shortcomings? We are going to be discussing each and every organization that we are going to look at. We're going to look at their formation, how it was formed, then the organization, the structure, how is it structured? Because we are saying it involves many countries, oftenly across continents. So how are they structured? How do they carry out their activities? That is the organ or organization. Then you're going to look at the performance. What are the achievements, if any, of these organizations? Or if there is shortcomings, you're also going to be discussing that in this topic. The other thing that we are going to be discussing in this topic is the Cold War. The Cold War that ensued. We are going to define what the Cold War is. Immediately after the Second World War, countries, or the two blocs that had been formed, that is the capitalist and the communist blocs, the Western and the Eastern blocs, how they were fighting. Now, this was not a physical war like the World War that we had discussed in our previous topic. Now, this was war of words, war of propaganda, or economic sanctions. One country or one nation sanctioning another nation. And then lastly, we are going to be discussing the non-aligned movement as part of the international organizations, or a movement that involved many nations. So, in a nutshell, these are the issues we are going to be dealing with in this topic when we talk of international relations. So, to start us off, my dear learner, let us start at looking at the methods in which countries interacted, or countries interact in the world we are living in today, and especially which with reference from the time of the Second World War, when the Second World War ended, until now. How have nations been interacting? So, methods or ways of interaction. Ways of interaction. So that is what we are going to discuss to start us off in our today's lesson. So I've mentioned immediately after the First World or the Second World War, there was a period of peace. Nations could now come together. They saw the importance of them coming together and sticking together, trying to solve their problems amicably, as opposed to threatening or attacking the other nation. So there are different ways in which independent nations, remember we are talking of states or countries that are independent from the other. So how do they interact? So the first way in which they interact, the first method of interaction is political relations. Political relations. So when you talk of political relations, this involves, let me underline this so that there is, so when you talk of political relations, this involves ideologies. It involves ideologies. When you talk of an ideology, is the driving power or the understanding. What drives a person? The belief system of a nation or of a group of people. That is the ideologies. So different countries that had the same ideologies came together. They made alliances or they made unions to come or discuss the issues because they have the same thinking pattern. They have the same way of handling issues. That is the ideologies. And even beyond the different ideologies, as we are going to discuss in the coming lessons, you'll find that nations found a way of accommodating even competing ideologies. So when you talk of ideologies, there are two major ideologies that existed at the time. We had the capitalist ideology that was adopted by the Western Bloc. I'm sure you have already learned that, which was happening during the Second World War, the Western Bloc. And then we had the communist ideology that was held by the Eastern Bloc. This was led by the USSR. I'm sure you have already discussed that. So these were the major ideologies in the world. The communist ideology, and they had the capitalist ideology. So these were the ideologies that were driving the world at that time. So nations that had a capitalistic view, right, could come and could easily interact with one another, and the communists also. But of importance to note is that even post the Second World War, these blocs found way of interacting. Yes, they have different ideologies, but they started borrowing ideas from others. So you'll find nations that would adopt part of capitalist ideology and part of the communist ideology. So that is the first way in which countries or nations that are sovereign, I want you to remember that each nation is independent from the other, found ways of interacting. The first one is political relations. The second one, we are going to discuss the economic relations. Economic relations. So this involves adopting trade treaties or trading with one another. So when you talk of economy, remember in history, when you hear the word economy in history, you are talking of the livelihood of people. So economic relations involved trading activities. Trade. So nations started to trade and export and import from their neighbors. You'd find countries that initially were not or were hostile to one another, post the Second World War, they could now start interacting or finding trade or markets or a source of raw materials from even the countries that were competing with them. So after the Second World War, countries found ways or relaxed their restrictions to trade. So they would work together. They would exchange. They would now started using of common currency. Common currency was another way. Common currency. So you'd find nations using the same kind of currency so that to ease their trade activities with one another. That is another way in which they could interact. Also, you'd find a country giving loans and grants. You'd find a country that is more economically empowered, for example, the USA, giving other nations loans so that they could revive their economies. Remember, one of the effects of the world wars was the economies of the world came to almost most of them. There was a very great depression or recession in the economies. So they had to revive their economies. So they had to loan each other. They had to loan, that is, give monies to help economies to be revived. They also give grants. Grants is money that is given out and you do not expect it back. It's like a gift. So in times of, when you talk of economy, there are countries that could able to be share their economies, or they could share their economic knowledge, and also giving physical loans or physical money to make sure that countries do not their economies do not go down, right? So that is another way in which the countries were able to interact. Remember, we are talking of an international organization or international interactions. So countries from different continents were able to interact in terms of trade and even having the same currency, and as I've explained, having the loans and grants given to them. Apart from that, there was also diplomatic relations. That is number 3. Diplomatic relations. There are diplomatic relations. When you talk of diplomacy, diplomacy means there is cordial, there is peaceful interactions. So diplomatic relations was another very essential way in which countries or nations in the world now interact. They send, or they have diplomats being sent from one nation to the other. These diplomats, you have heard of ambassadors or high commissioners. So after the World War, nations started sending representatives. Diplomats are representatives of one nation to the other. So you'd find each and every nation striving to have a representative representing the interests or representing that nation in a foreign nation. So you'd find, for example, talk about the nation of Kenya, for example. You'll find Kenyans, we shall send ambassadors to other nations so that they can represent us in those nations, market for what we have, and also find ways in which we can interact with other nations. So that is diplomatic relations. So diplomats were sent from one nation to the other. These made sure that in case there is a problem, these diplomats or these ambassadors or high commissioners could be able to solve the issues that could have risen. Also, apart from diplomatic relations, there is social-cultural interactions. There is socio-cultural interaction. There is socio-cultural interactions or interactions. So when you talk of social cultural, that involves, or this involves, exchange of culture and ideas. Countries started exchanging or learning from one another. As a result of the war, people moved from one nation to the other. So when they found out that there are people living or have different cultures than ours, nations started to exchange their ideas. They started to exchange their beliefs, and they could also exchange their skills. So there was exchange of culture. That is the first interaction when we talk of that. People's way of life, beliefs, right? And then also exchange of skills. Exchange of skills. A very good example is in the medical field. In the medical field, you'll find doctors coming from one nation, going to another nation to train the people of that nation or doctors in that nation. You'll find teachers coming from one nation, going to another, so that they can be able to train that other nation that does not have resources. So there was interactions in terms of exchange of skills. A very good example that we have seen in Kenya is when you have seen the Cuban doctors. Doctors from Cuba coming to help or train together with or train the Kenyan doctors, or even just offer their services where they are needed. That is a very good example that we can cite of how the nations have been interacting. Another way in which they have interacted socially and culturally is through games. Is through games. So you have found or you have heard of different countries coming together to compete against one another in games. They are not competing to fight, no. They are competing as a way of interacting. You have heard of Olympics, right? You have heard of we have our own Eliud Kipchoge who is competing for us. We have heard David Rudisha, right? We have heard Julius Yego, who was competing in the javelin, right? You have also had other competitions like the World Cup, that is in football. So those are ways in which nations today are interacting. So you'll find each and every nation will want to be represented in these games. And as they interact, there is relations or there is peace. And then lastly, there is humanitarian assistance. Humanitarian assistance. So this is where you find in case there is famine, for example, or there are floods, you'll find other nations coming to help. Whenever there is a problem, nations will bring in help, or they will come and rescue these nations that have been affected. Where there are refugees, yeah, nations are able to accept people who have run away from their nations because of internal wrangles. That is another way in which nations have been interacting. And then lastly, the last way in which countries have been interacting is through international organizations. International organization. When you talk of an international organization, this is an organization that each and every country or draws membership. Members of these organizations are drawn from different countries in different continents. So for an organization to be an international organization, it has to have members from different countries in different continents. So there were organizations that were created to promote international peace. That was their main aim, promote international peace. That was their main aim. So these were created to bring peace in the world. An example is the United Nations. That is one organization that has been created. It has so many, almost every country in the world is a member of the United Nations. And we are going to be discussing that in our coming lessons. Another one or another organization is the is the Commonwealth Organization. These are different countries that have come together to make sure or to safeguard or to make sure that there is peace in the world. And we are going to be discussing very examples, singular organizations that run throughout the world to make sure that there is peace or see that there is peace being experienced among the nations. So those are the different ways in which the countries of the world are able to interact. I've talked of political relations, that is ideologies, right, or beliefs. Those who have the same system of administration, you will find them coming together. For example, the Commonwealth countries, they were under the British colony. You'll find them coming together. Then we have the economic relations, that has to do with trade and the economies of the world. People will want, or countries will want to be able to work with one another. We have talked of diplomacy, social, cultural interaction. So as we come to the end of our first lesson in this topic, that is an introduction, I would want you to attempt this question, very simple question, to help you attempt or to help you internalize what we have already, what we have learned today. So we have a revision question, and the question is: identify ways in which countries interact. Identify ways in which countries interact. And I'm sure you are able to attempt that question. So with that, we have come to our history and government lesson for today. I've been your teacher, Conan Gakure. Bye-bye.